Hi, my name is Mary Gavin, and I'm a former Mormon. And I'm excited to be able to share my story here today. One of my favorite things is to hear people's stories and how they're saved out of Mormonism. And it's so amazing to me how God works so differently in each and every person's life. Every story is so precious and so different. And, some people are saved to know Christ immediately. My story is much different. It was very agonizing and painful. I grew up in a liberal Mormon or Methodist church, and it was during the 60s when political stuff was stressed in our church. I don't think they ever opened a Bible. It was about the blacks and just how horrible white people were, and it just used to get my father so upset. When I was 12, I became a member of the Methodist church, so I had to learn certain doctrines of the church. I don't really remember much about that. After I was 12, because my father was so upset about the leanings of the church, we stopped going altogether. And I always had a heart for to try and be a good person. It's interesting, in my mind, sexual sin and alcoholism, they were fairly rampant in the town that I lived in, Corning, New York. And so those were things that were, I always felt like I was a fairly good person because I didn't entangle myself that way. When I was 18, the missionaries started coming to our home, and my mom was listening to them. And it's interesting, at the time, my mother and father had a pot of coffee in the morning and a pot of coffee at night, and the missionaries never mentioned one thing about the word of wisdom or coffee. And for months. And I never listened to the missionaries, but at the end of my first year of college, somehow these two missionaries kind of got a hold of me and started talking to me. And I remember one day I invited my Catholic friend over to the missionary lessons, and the missionaries were talking about the need for the restoration because the authority had been lost from the earth, and he says, and as a perfect example are the Catholics. And he looked at my friend and he said, look how your doctrines have changed over and over the years. That just proves that, there needs to be a restoration back to what there used to be. And, I was really struck by that at the time. And I had a question for the missionaries, and I said, how will I know? Oh, and the big thing was, of course, the restoration and a living prophet today that was God's mouthpiece to us. And I said, how will I know? Would I know that a prophet would never lead me astray? And the missionary said, God would strike him dead before he would let him lead you astray. And now that Mormon missionary wasn't lying to me. He really believed what he was speaking. And I just, this is an old Melchizedek priesthood book from the 1960s. And I just had found this so interesting. I probably shouldn't read the whole thing, but it talks about the restoration, why we needed. When Mormons say, why do you pick on us? I always think of Joseph Smith's testimony and how caustic that is to a Christian. That our creeds are an abomination and our teachers are corrupt. And
what's the book?
This is called Apostasy to Restoration, Melchizedek Priesthood Quorum book that they would study in 1960. This was the book that they studied. And so this would have probably been, the parents and maybe even some of the missionaries were affected by this teaching that came to my home. And he talks about the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians 12:28 and Ephesians 4:11 and 12 stated that the apostles and prophets had been placed in the church of Jesus Christ by Christ himself to be his leaders on earth. When they disappeared, the leadership was gone. Without the authority from Christ to lead his church, no organization could then rightfully be called the Church of Jesus Christ. That an organization survived is self-evident. That it perpetuated for some years some of the fundamental teachings such as faith in God, immersion baptism, and belief in the resurrection of true Christianity, no one can deny. That there were sincere believers and dedicated leaders, history testifies that they considered themselves to be the Church of Jesus Christ, the members affirmed through their faith and suffering. But that it was Christ's church when it was without divine authority is not in keeping with early Christian understanding. The word Christian was originally used to designate one who was a follower of Christ. In common usage, it has come to mean anyone or anything in the ongoing line of the ever-changing Christian churches. It would be more proper to prefix the qualification so-called before the word Christian, as that alone is worthy of the designation of Christian, which holds to that which was given by Christ. And he goes on pretty much to say that from this statement it is evident that there were remnants of early Christianity which survived, but Christ could not accept the remnants as his own church. So all of Christianity was not recognized as Christ's church by Christ himself. That's basically what the Mormons are saying. We use the word Christianity to designate the so-called Christian world about us, and the reader must be conscious of the fact that we are using the word in this sense. We are not using it to suggest that this is true Christianity, but rather a designation used to refer to the changing churches which have emerged from the original Christian movement. The form of Christianity, as the word is commonly used, varied from century to century. So that's basically what those Mormon missionaries were saying, that everything was lost. Christ himself wouldn't accept any of the Christian churches today. And now, up until this point, I had never, ever prayed publicly in my life. And the missionaries, every night when they'd leave, they'd always ask me to pray. And I'd say, no. And one night, one of the two sweet little missionaries, from Mexico, he prayed a prayer and he actually wept. And he prayed that I would go to a quiet place. And as this says in the Book of Mormon, that I would, pray to know if the church was true and that I would have that burning in my bosom. Well, of course, he'd already piqued my emotions by weeping for me. And so I was so touched that I did go into my room and I did pray. And I did get, a feeling, the same kind of feeling that you get when you see you've all seen emotional movies that just really get your burning in your bosom going. That's the kind of thing that I had. But I really thought that was the real thing. And so it wasn't long. I finished the lessons, and in December of 1970, I was baptized along with 4 members of my family, and then one more member was baptized after that. So all of us except my sister, who was away in graduate studies in archaeology of South America, she didn't fall for it, and she didn't join. And I had already applied to go to Utah State into wildlife biology. And so I got baptized in December, and then I met Randy in March. It was his last place that he went before he went home from his mission. And of course, the missionaries are so extremely impressive. They're schooled in, the dress code, a hair code, and how to respond to people in love and all those kind of things. And it really is effective, and especially when you're in a really ungodly part of society and you see ungodly things. These guys are like a shining star. And I met the missionaries, and I was so impressed that I knew that I wanted to have a good, godly life like that. I wanted to marry a man like that. I wanted to have children that would grow up to be Mormon missionaries. And I remember the first time I went to a Mormon church, I was struck by how plain, nothing. Where my Methodist church, we had beautiful stained glass windows that told the whole story of Christ's life and death and resurrection, and there was nothing. And I was surprised. And he said, "Oh, are you surprised there's no crosses here?" And I said, "Well, I'm surprised there's nothing here. No pictures or nothing." And he says, "Well, everyone wonders why we don't have a cross." And he says, "Think about it this way. If someone came and shot your father, would you want to hang the gun on the wall?" And I didn't think that was a real good explanation, but it went. And anyway, so I love the Mormon people, and I was eager to learn. I remember getting called almost immediately to a calling, and the bishopric fellow that took me aside, and he said, "Now I want you to know how serious this is when you get a calling from the church." He said, "The bishop and his counselors have prayed about it, and this has come directly from God. And so, you are really called to this position from God himself." And so, you take it, like the first thing they did was put me the head of a road show. And I had never seen one, had no clue. I had to write it, put it together, and it was a pretty horrible experience for me.
A road show? What do you...
Well, they used to have road shows. Plays.
Once or twice a year we would come up with a play, and then we'd travel around the state and region and put these plays on. So it was just part of keeping us very busy and active.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
A Mormon circus?
Yeah, basically.
Yeah, it was nice. It was a fun
Yeah,
activity.
it was. They have lots of fun things for kids, and I was blown away by the talents of the women and the things that they were able to accomplish. And I always felt a heavy burden that way. Anyway, so December I was baptized, and then that August my parents, in July I was in the Hilkamore pageant, and Randy was already gone. And when the first time I saw Randy, I knew, I don't know how, but God just let me know that guy was going to be my husband.
You had a burden in your bosom.
It must have been something. Randy didn't know. I don't even think he noticed me much at all, but I just had this sense that, he would be the man that I would marry. And did the Hilkamore pageant, and at that time, hot pants and really short skirts were in style. And I was a real young, thin girl.
Very style conscious.
But anyway, to be in pageant, you had to be able to kneel on your knees, and your skirt had to touch the ground. So I had to make a whole wardrobe for myself. And I remember after I got it done, my father actually laughed at me and said, "Oh my God, you look so ridiculous in those clothes." And I felt kind of silly. But anyway, in those days, they didn't have so many converts out in the East, so they bussed in, I think it was either 2 busfuls of BYU co-eds. And the first thing that just blew my socks off is none of their skirts would have reached the ground when they got knelt on their knees. And so they had a different standard than I did. But anyway, it was a great experience for me working with the missionaries and getting to be in the pageant. And Randy had gone to work at a Jewish camp with some people that he baptized from his mission. And he came there and he met his parents and grandparents, and I went and met them, and there was nothing between us or anything. Anyway, but for me, I was like, took my breath away. And then in August, my father drove me out to Utah State, and Randy had invited us and probably many other people to stop through Arizona if we ever came out that way. Now, being in the East, all the states are small, short distances. We looked at the map and we thought, oh, here's Arizona, here's Utah. That's not very far. We'll go through Arizona. Of course, the states are huge, and it was hot, really hot. And my father was pulling a trailer with my stuff in it. I was from a family of 6 people, and I think everybody but my oldest brother and sister. So there was 4 kids and 2 parents in our station wagon. And as soon as we saw the Welcome to Arizona sign, we hit some orange crates had fallen off a truck. My father ran over them, and we got 3 flat tires out on the Navajo Indian Reservation. And it was horrible. Anyway, we got to Mesa, and I visited with Randy. And I think we were there. They were there for 3 days, saw a lot of sights, had a great time with his wonderful family. And the last night that we were there, another missionary came down from somewhere in Arizona. Taylor. And I don't know, something just struck, and Randy and I headed off all of a sudden. And so I went to Utah State, and Randy had a friend that had a girlfriend at BYU. So how many miles was it?
About 750 miles one way.
One way. So Randy, we dated 5 times. I went down there Thanksgiving and then at Christmas. And then we got married in the Mesa Temple in February 18th, 1972. And so 14 months after I was baptized, I went to the temple. And I have to say, that was extremely scary for me to go to the temple. You go in and they take, you separate, go down these stairs, and they tell you to take off all your clothes and put on this little hospital gown with...
Separate, wait, go back, separate, what do you mean?
We were going to get married that day.
Okay.
Randy, we had already been to the temple, but
So we went into the temple together.
Okay.
And then she went one way and I went the other way.
Okay.
And then we were separate.
And then we never saw each other again until we went through all this stuff.
Okay.
But they take you in and they wash and anoint your body. I actually have this book. It's quite old. What's going on in there, and it goes through all the exactly what they say to you. And they give you a new name. My new name was Lydia. And the lady said to me, to make me feel like it was special and different, she said that now, is there someone in your genealogy line that has that name? And I said, well, I never heard of that name before, so I don't know of anybody. Later, a couple of years later, as I was doing my genealogy, I did find someone named Lydia in my genealogy, so I thought that was special. Now, the thing about the names is, of course, you all have heard this before. Randy could know my name, but I couldn't know his, and because it would be up to him to call me forth.
If I wanted to.
If he wanted to. So that was kind of hard to hear. But I love the idea of celestial marriage and all that. That was one of those things. Like being pregnant all the time wouldn't have bothered me, I don't think. I just was so thrilled to think that I would be in heaven forever with him. That's where my head was, I guess. But one of the things that was troubling to me was the contradictory commands that God would give. That, he said, multiply and replenish the earth, but Adam and Eve had to break the commandment of not to eat the fruit before they could do that. And you wonder, if you had thought about it in a real way, you would have thought, there was the animals and they were procreating. How could you miss how that worked, But anyway, the other thing that troubled me was Satan came out and participated in so much of the ceremony. I was very young, very naive, and I was overwhelmed at the time because, you get this little bag with all these little things in there, and as you go from room to room and you take all the oaths, and of course ours was in 72, so it was before they changed the temple ceremony, and we took the, all blood oaths and covenants that, if we revealed any of those things, our life would be taken by, disembowelment or cutting our throat or opening our chest and cutting out our heart. And so, and as you progress, you went through the Garden of Eden room and then into the laundry world, and then the Aaronic priesthood. I don't remember what room that was, but Aaronic priesthood and the Melchizedek priesthood. And one thing I wanted to share with you about that is Mormons that's their big thing, is the Aaronic and the Melchizedek priesthood. And the Bible tells us that the Aaronic priesthood was abolished forever by Jesus, and that he is the only holder of the Melchizedek priesthood forever. Hebrews chapter 7 and 8, especially 7, verses 17 through 18 and 24. Jesus said, "Swear not at all, but let your communications be yea, yea, nay, nay, for whatever is more than these cometh of evil." Matthew 5:34, 37. "And I spake openly to the world, and in secret I said nothing." John 18:20. The contradictions between the scriptures and the temple rituals are too numerous for one to even attempt to list here. And anyway, one other thing. So we went through all the stuff. Each time you have to change your robe from I think it's the left shoulder is the Aaronic priesthood, the right shoulder is the Melchizedek priesthood, and then Satan comes out and he has this apron on, and of course, my father was a Mason, and I had actually he wanted me to become an Eastern Star, and I had started to do that, but we went into one of the ceremonies, and all I remember, I don't even remember how old I was, but I remember it was dark, and we're going in candles, and it was so creepy, scary, and satanical that I never wanted anything further to do with it again. I mean, my father had the ring, and he was, all the way out Mason. He never did much of it after he was older. But anyway, the devil comes out with his little apron on, with the thing on there, much like the Masonic apron, representing the principalities and powers of the world and everything. And he instructs Adam and Eve to take out, you get this little silk apron with embroidered leaves on it, and he tells you to put the apron on. And, we know that man's effort to cover his sins, but then God came down and he told them that he foreshadowed Christ by killing an animal, shedding his blood, and covering them with skins. Now, the interesting thing about the Mormon is the devil gives them that apron, tells them to cover themselves with that apron, and they wear that apron throughout the whole temple ceremony. And I never forget how shocked I was in 2005 when Randy's father died, and we went to his funeral, and it was an open casket, and he's all decked out in his temple garment, and he still has that fig leaf apron on. Yeah. What an offense to our Lord to still be covering, trying to make recompense for your own sin with that apron. And my heart goes out to Mormons that somehow they can't see how, they want to say that they're Christians, and yet, everything is so lopsided opposite of what Christ is, what he did. And anyway, so after we get done with all the covenants, and that we took the secret handshakes, and you come to, there's so much more to it, but you come to the veil. And the interesting thing about the veil is, think about it, when Christ was crucified, the veil rent, and yet here Mormons have the veil back up there again, and we have to go through it. Because when Christ died, we didn't need anybody to intercede for us anymore. And the thing that always used to frustrate me when I went to the temple, there were so many things to remember to do, and if you didn't do it exactly right, they'd stop the ceremony. and they'd come and help you, and it was so humiliating. And of course, here I was in my wedding dress, covered up with all this stuff, and there's my husband over there, and by the time we get to a certain place, he looks like a baker. He's got a baker's hat on, and I'm thinking, whoa. And the only redeeming thing about this is you see, there's our doctor and, the mayor and other important people. So it's, after I left the church, I think it's like that nursery rhyme, where...
Emperor has no clothes.
Yeah, the emperor's new clothes. They thought, nobody dares say that they're naked, I mean, this is so ridiculous. But anyway, so we got to the veil, and I used to think, I am never going to make it to heaven, because they, I can't remember all this stuff. They'd have to come up and knock on the little thing, and whatever.
Wanted.
Are you worthy, or have come to converse with you at the veil and all that, and they'd have to help me through the whole thing. And then you'd get into the celestial room, and they'd tell you, you can't ever talk about anything. If you ever have a question, you have to ask it here, and they give you your little temple garment. And of course, in our day, they were the kind that were one piece and drop seat, and the only instruction we got was you never take them off except to take a shower or something. And so at first, and I struggled with that, but anyway, then they went to two-piece garments, and of course the garments have the corresponding sign of the square and all those things on them. And then we went in the to be married in the marriage room, where they have the thing you kneel on each side. What do you call those? Altar. And then they have mirrors, and you can see, and it's supposed to be seeing into eternity. And I remember my mom and dad didn't have temple recommend, so they couldn't come to my wedding. And I remember that my mom, afterwards, she had sunglasses on, and I looked, and my mom's eyes were swollen shut from crying all night long because she wasn't able to come to my wedding. And, that was a real bittersweet pill, of course, after I find out that it's all hogwash anyway, that I put my mom through all that. But, and the interesting thing about the marriage ceremony, if I just could share this one thing with you. And before you went through the veil, you also had the Law of Consecration. And one of the parts of it is that you do consecrate yourselves, your time, talents, and everything with which the Lord has blessed you, or with which he may bless you, to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, for the building up of the kingdom of God on the earth, and for the establishment of Zion. And not, you weren't giving everything back to the Lord, but you're giving it back to the Mormon Church to build it up. And, how is that any better than the Roman Catholic Church or, any of those? And of course, just so I don't forget it, the burning in the bosom thing, whenever we witness to people and they come to a point where they're really convicted and they're uncomfortable, they always fall back to say, there's nothing you could say that would affect my testimony, because I've had a burning in my bosom, and I know this is true. Well, and I always say, well, did you know that the Muslims, when they strap a bomb on their back, that they feel exactly the same way? They have that burning in the bosom, that feeling, that they know that what they believe is true. And, feelings are nothing that we can trust. And that was what was such a stumbling block for me for such a long time. But anyway, back to the marriage ceremony. After we went through our vows back and forth, the sealer said, "By virtue of the holy priesthood and the authority vested in me, I pronounce you, Randy, and Mary, legally and lawfully husband and wife for time and for all eternity. And I seal upon you the blessings of the holy resurrection, with power to come forth in the morning of the first resurrection, clothed in glory, immortality, and eternal lives. And seal upon you the blessings of kingdoms, thrones, principalities, powers, dominions, and exaltations, with all the blessings of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And say unto you, be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth." And as I thought back on that thrones, principalities, powers, and dominions, I mean, that's very demonic and very frightening to me. And I've always, there was one time Randy and I were going to renew our vows, and anyway, I've always felt like that was some important thing to do, and just things happened in our lives at that time, and I guess it was Satan perhaps keeping us from doing that. And as I grew in the church, when the missionaries come to your house, they don't tell you all the stuff. Matter of fact, they don't tell you anything. Because once you're in there, of course, you love the people, and you get adapted. It's your life. It's your culture. It becomes, it's your community. Everything revolves around it. And, I learned about the law of eternal progression. And this is where the Mormons totally changed the nature of God. As man is, God once was. As God is, man will become. And, we learned that we lived in a pre-existence, that we had a heavenly mother, and the God of this planet had slews of women and had lots of children. And all these children are, well, let's go back. They, they had a plan. God picked two of his spirit children, Jesus and his brother Satan, and they both proposed a plan. Jesus, that people would come and get to choose, and then he would come and pay for their sins. And Satan's was that he would come down and pretty much force everyone to be good and then bring everybody back to the Father. And there was a great war in heaven. And I liked the way we heard somebody say, without bodies, how did they have this great war? Did they say, bad things to each other, or swish by, or, what kind of a battle did they have without bodies? But anyway, they had this battle, and all through the time I was in the Mormon church, there would always be scuttlebutt about this thing of the pre-existence. Someone would have given a talk in a stake meeting or something. Like, we lived up in Salt Lake, Temple Square area. There was the lower part, and then it went up to where, like, the apostles and all those guys lived. McConkie, we used to see him walk home from work. And people would give talks saying that, according to how righteous you were in the pre-existence determined where you came to on the earth. Like, the most valiant came to the wealthy Mormon homes. And that really made some people feel fairly slighted because they didn't have as much money. So people that were wealthy and Mormon, the most righteous in the pre-existence went to those homes. And the ones that were kind of on the fence and not so righteous, they went in the underdeveloped countries, poor, poverty-stricken. And, of course, the blacks were one. God wanted to identify the blacks so that people would know that they couldn't hold the priesthood. They couldn't become gods. There weren't any black gods. And so... and of course, everyone knows that it was through BYU's, BYU had black students there for their sports. And, but they were kind of sequestered off because they didn't, in those days, the early times of the church, they didn't believe in intermarrying or anything. Randy, on his mission, this one family who had been very active in the church and they were lighter skinned, they found, as doing their genealogies, they found out that they had Negro in them, and they immediately pulled the priesthood from them. And very, very prejudiced in the early days. But it came to where the government said, we're going to pull some funding from you guys if you don't, do away with this doctrine. And the church said, well, we don't get money from you. And they said, well, 75 to 80% of your students do get aid, and then we're going to pull that. Students to BYU. So anyway, God had a revelation that he could forgive the blacks and they could receive the priesthood. And, you would, according to the scriptures, you would think that they would automatically start having white babies, but they didn't, And just like with the Indians, it said that as they became less sinful and came to know God, that they would become pure or white and delightsome. And then that didn't happen, so then they changed the scriptures to pure and delightsome. Well, I had 3 boys, and then I lost a 4th boy. And we lived in Salt Lake. We were both very active. I was primary president for the second time, I think, when this happened. Randy was stake mission president, and one of our friends did yard work, and he always had those headphones on. Randy never knew such a thing as Christian radio existed, but that Henry Aunt, is that his name? John Henry Aunt from California, on the radio gave a challenge that if anyone could prove that Brigham Young hadn't taught that Adam was out, he'd give him $1,000. So our friend came to our house, and he was in the Elders Quorum presidency, and he told Randy about it, and Randy said, hey, let's shut this guy up, take his money, shut him out. So they divided up the research, and Randy had already found it on his mission. He talked about that in his story. He found it in a pamphlet blowing across the road on his mission, done by a pastor who said that Brigham Young had taught aliens of God, and he gave where it was found, and Randy looked it up, and sure enough it was there. But it didn't take him out of the church still. But here it was, came up again, and Randy either forgot that he looked at it before or whatever. But Randy went and did his research, and Randy, they were both called Randys. My Randy did his research, and the other Randy came to the door and said, I'm done. This is scary. I don't want, to go any further with it. But our neighbor across the street, he was a high councilman, and Randy had told him about what he was struggling with, trying to find information about, and he gave Randy that Bruce R. McConkie letter between him and Eugene, England, where he actually admits that Brigham Young did, and it was right at the time that President Spencer W. Kimball had come out, and it was in the newspaper that he said that Brigham Young never did teach that. And but here's this letter from Bruce R. McConkie, which says yes, he did teach it. And this Eugene, England was doing firesides at BYU, telling people that they did it, and he believed it, and his membership was going to be challenged if he didn't stop, and that's what this letter was about. So that was pretty devastating for us. And then because of our positions and because they could see that we were starting to struggle, we got invited to this elite group up on the hill with a lot of church historians, the architect that built a lot of the Mormon temples. And it was really quite shocking to be there because these people talked about, how many versions did they talk about? 9. They said that there were 9 versions to the verse vision, and the church hadn't decided which one to canonize yet. And of course, to me, Randy and I were iron rodders. These guys were all Leahona. That's Lehi's dream. Well, we believed it wholeheartedly. And so... Can you explain Lehi's dream? You explain it, Randy. I'm not...
Well, in the Book of Mormon, the same dream that Joseph Smith's father had before the Book of Mormon was ever written is of the tree of life. And the people are struggling along the bank of a river, and they're holding on to an iron rod that keeps them from falling away, falling into the river, falling into harm. And up ahead, the tree of life is ahead, but on their way they encounter wealth and a spacious building, and there's people that are looking across the river and laughing at them, making fun of them, mocking them, because they're holding to the iron rod, and these people are obviously enjoying the wealth of this earth and going forward. So the comparison was given. In fact, we had a talk in our stake given where it was explained that some of you are iron rodders. You hold to the word, and others don't have the proclivity to search like that, and they just simply believe the experience and love the church just as much. So they were called the Leahonas, which was the compass that God prepared for Lehi when he went through the wilderness. So that's the story of that.
And so obviously these people were Leahona. Their big thing that they wanted to do is they wanted to get, they were just building the history museum down there. And they wanted to get more pictures of Christ and the church and stuff. And there was, the two sides. And anyway, when the 9 versions of the first vision, that is the whole basis of what the whole church was based on. So it was like, to me, I was pregnant with it was my 5th pregnancy, but my 4th child. So it was just devastating to me to hear. And I said, now, if you guys don't believe this, because of the things that they were saying and talking about history and things that I'd never ever in my life heard before about Joseph Smith and just all this stuff, it was like so depressing and just hurt my soul. And I said, if you guys don't believe this is true, why are you here? If this is true what you're saying, I can't be here. And they said, well, we believe that this is the best thing for our family, that there's nothing else out there, and that this is the best way to raise our families. And anyway, I loved the church at this point. It was a struggle for me. Randy and I passed each other. We were both so trying to live up to our temple vows. We did genealogy, visiting, teaching, all this stuff that you do. And we passed in the night, and Randy had all of his executive meetings and temple meetings and Sunday morning meetings and everything. We had all these little children, and it was very hard for us. And it makes me sad as I look back at what I sacrificed, for the church. Anyway, so Randy, somehow he found the Calvary Chapel lending library, which was downtown, and every time that he went there, no one was ever there. But he would check out books. He would work all day, come home, and he'd read all night long. And I was busy, and I did not want to hear anything. I didn't want to leave the church. I just couldn't imagine life without it. And so Randy, one morning I woke up, and he was sitting with his little light over and he'd been up all night long reading, and he had tears running down his face. And I said, Randy, what is wrong? What happened? And he said, Mary, the church isn't true. We've been lied to. And I was so devastated. And things got stressful. God brought a particular person into our life, and I really can honestly say that I hated this person. He was trying to draw us out. Finally, I said, he's not allowed in our home anymore. And things got more stressful. Randy, I think, would have become a Christian a whole bunch faster than he did even. But, and he tells his story on YouTube. You can listen to it. I won't say it again. But one of the things, the day that he went down to the lending library, I think it was the time that he actually deceived me. He dropped all of us off at church and I thought he was going to his meetings, but he snuck off and went down to the lending library. And for the first time, there were these men there, and Randy had never seen him before, but they had seen him, and they said, "Oh, we've seen you come in, blah, blah, blah." And they asked him to pray with them, and they led him in the sinner's prayer. And Randy said when he left, the burden was lifted.
Hallelujah.
And he was so excited, and he wanted to go just shout, run around the streets and shout. And he knew that he couldn't come home and tell me because I couldn't have handled it. And I remember, I came a point where I knew the church wasn't true anymore. But, I guess I had heard so many testimonies, and every testimony meaning this is the only true church here upon the face of the earth, and if this isn't it, then there's nothing. And, about the great apostasy and how all the churches are wrong and everything. So, I just couldn't. I thought, well, I'm going to go with those people that say this is the best thing for our families and this is where I want to be. And, Mormon people they love the Lord, they're seeking the Lord, even though they don't know that they're deceived and totally don't know who He is. And there were so many that I admired, and I wanted to have that kind of a family. And I really had never met somebody that ever in my life that said that they were a born-again Christian. And I had only seen, people that were not what I would consider godly people who went to church even. So I wanted no part of it. And so Randy and I started to have some issues. And I remember one morning my oldest son, I had my fourth child. There was 3 boys, and then I had a little girl. And Randy wanted to tell my oldest son. He said, I have to tell him the truth. I can't have him grow up. And I said, oh, please don't tell him. Because, we didn't have anything else to offer. We just knew the church wasn't true. And, what was that? But anyway, Randy prevailed. And I'll never forget, Jack had stayed home, and he was so excited. We bought this expensive set of Mormon history, and he was all excited about Joseph Smith and telling us all these exciting exploits and blah, blah, blah. And Randy went in and told him. And Jack I could see how devastated he was, and it broke my heart. And it's so sad that somehow God didn't give me sooner. I was a real stickler for living it to the T. The word of wisdom, I believe coffee was sin. Every year you had to go get a new temple recommend. I remember the first time I went in for a temple recommend, and the questions that they ask you, the 5 points of morality. And I remember hearing things that I never knew anyone would even do that were parts of morality. And pardon?
What are the?
There's eyes. Let's see. Thoughts,
eyes, pornography, actual physical sexual sin,
and then sex self-sex and lesbian sex or homosexual sex and sex with animals, and they got real specific. Have you ever had sex with a chicken? I don't know. Who would even think? Randy said that they did that to him when he was a young boy. When he went, asked him that question, I thought, what a sick, twisted thing to even put that in the mind of a young person. They didn't ask us stuff like that so much when we were older, but you'd get bishops that wouldn't let you have a temple recommend if you drank Coke, Pepsi, and then those that would let you do it if you did those. We didn't do anything caffeine. We were, we did it all the way. And probably to the detriment of our children because, anyway, our kids started to be we started to fall out of the church, stop going. And there were a few things that happened. And because we were high-profile people in the church, people would always come by. And people thought Randy had a secret sin. And that's, was why he was the one. Because I didn't really want to leave, and everybody knew that. But then people would come and say, "Why are you leaving?" We'd say, "You don't want to know. We are in such pain and turmoil. We can't do this to you." And then sometimes they would beg us to the point that we would share with them. And I am not kidding you. They would put their hands on their ears, start shaking their head like this, and stop it, I can't hear anymore. And they would get up and leave, and we would never see them again. People that we thought loved us and that we loved. I mean, that was our community. I mean, you live in a small area, you church, and everything you do is with those Mormon people. And so it was a very difficult time, and we moved during that time to another area. And for a little while we started going to churches, but it was like culture shock for me. And I would smell coffee for one thing, and I'd think, man, these guys are sinners. I could get me out of here. Or I'd hear their sermons or something, and I'd think, oh man, they're washed up, things. I mean, I would get up in the middle of a service and I would be crying, and I'd leave, and I'd wait out by the car until the family came. And then Randy really did it. He took me to an Assemblies of God church, and where they broke out in tongues and all that stuff. And that was way
Seizures.
Culture shock for me. And I didn't go to church at all again for a long time. And then we went back to the church for a little while, and I had my 5th child, another daughter. Very sad times. I mean, I couldn't think of a reason to want to live anymore, because I thought, if there's a God, he is really awful, that he would have led me into this false church. And now I've got all these kids, and my life is a mess. And so we went back to the church for a while. And then I remember my oldest son had gone he was passing the sacrament. He was a deacon. And he was at his class, and they talked about thousands and thousands of heavenly mothers up in heaven. And millions. And he had all these questions after. And Randy said, "That's it. I can't do it anymore. I'm done." And I mean, we had neighbors around that basically told us they hoped that God didn't have to take any of our children to get our attention and straighten us up.
Wow.
And anyway, things got worse and worse between us. Sundays were horrible days. I hated Sunday so bad. I hated God. I got to where I really hated God. And my kids were poor little lost little souls, and I couldn't even help them because I was lost too. And Randy was trying to hold us all together. And then he read that book by Spencer, correct? About where he had a Mormon wife that didn't want to leave, and he went around some bend or something, and God just showed him strongly that, you're not your wife's savior. I am. You can't save your wife. That's my job. And so it was really weird how God got us to go to church. It was through a little goat. I loved animals. And we had this goat. Jack actually had the goat, and then when it got too big, it was jumping on our 80-year-old neighbor's back and stuff, and when she was laying over doing flowers, and we thought, well, we have to get rid of that goat. So we took it to that Wheeler Farm, but it was so friendly and had been so much part of our family, it wouldn't stay in a cage. So they gave it to an equestrian park, which was way out south. And so Randy had started going to Salt Lake Christian Center, right? Or no, Southeast Christian Center. Because he'd seen that they had, the pastor was the was
Chaplain for the
for the jazz team. And he thought, that might be a good
for the
church.
boys.
Good for the boys. So he started going there, and then he said, well, if you'll come to church, I'll take you to visit your goat. So I started going to church, and of course the first thing was if you've ever been there, they have this huge foyer, and they always had this huge big table with donuts and cookies and big coffee pot, and I was like, oh, coffee. This isn't the true church, because that's one thing we were looking for, the true church everywhere we went, and this isn't the true church. And so anyway, Randy got me to go there a few weeks, and then he slowly weaned me into a Bible study with these wonderful people that were they discipled us and were just wonderful people. But anyway, he found out that coffee was just such a stumbling block to me. So he went to the elders. He was an elder, and he went to the elders board, and he said, what are we thinking? How can we witness in Salt Lake City to Mormons if coffee is a stumbling block like it is to Mary? It isn't to everybody like it was to me, but a lot of people it is. So on the other hand, they didn't want to stumble a weaker brother by taking coffee totally out. So what they did is they moved it up into a higher room, and they still had coffee and donuts and punch and everything when you came in, but the coffee and donuts and coffee and all the good stuff was up in a higher room too.
The celestial room.
Yeah, the celestial room. Well, when I heard what they did, I was so touched that they would love me and care about me enough that kind of took that stumbling block away. I still struggled, and I went to Bible study, and Randy and I were so disrupted, both of us. We had so many questions, and everybody there was just so nice to us. And
Mormons are problem people. When they leave, they're a problem for the Christian church.
Well,
Bible studies.
Anyway, things were getting really bad between Randy and I in our marriage. We had such a strong, powerful love between each other. That's the thing that held us through it all. But it was getting really bad. And the one week that we went out there, Randy read that book, and on the way out there, Randy said, I am going to make a public profession of faith today. He didn't tell me. Lindsay was just a babe in arms, and I got there, and the dog had run away that morning. Jack super glued Callie's fingers together on the way to church.
Josh's bike had been stolen.
Yeah, Josh's bike had been stolen. So everyone was ticked off. Nobody was speaking to each other. And I told Randy when we got there, I am staying in the car. I'm not even going in. So Randy took the kids, went in. And then, of course, after he was gone, I went in, and I went in the cry room with Lindsay. And, the sermon came and went, and then they did the altar call. And Randy and Josh, my youngest son, walked up front, and it was like a stabbing into my heart. And I thought, that's it. He chose, just like he always chose the Mormon church over me, now he's choosing church over me again. And I'm done. I'm done. And I just broke down and wept. And of course the whole church was weeping because everyone was so happy. And everyone came and, hugged me, and they knew why I was crying. That I wasn't crying because I was happy. And I felt like, and not only do I lose my husband, now I've lost my son. And anyway, a family crisis happened in New York, and I was the only one that was available. So I decided to take the two girls and go, and I thought, man, I am not coming back. This is the end. I'll figure something out and then get my sons. And so I remember Randy and the three boys took me to the airport. It was when you could walk right out to the airplane when you left. And I got on the plane and I looked down, and there stood Randy and the three little boys. And this feeling just flew over me, that there stands a righteous man. He loves you, and, you need to follow him. And so I knew that I would come back, and I wrestled with the Lord, and I thought, well, I believe that you're there, and you just set it all in motion, and you just don't communicate with us anymore. We're just on our own here. So I stayed out there and dealt with some pretty horky things that I had to deal with, and then I think I was gone for 6 weeks maybe, and then I came home. Of course, poor Randy, he suffered the whole time thinking I was never coming home. And the boys had some pretty awful things happen to them without their mother there to watch them, and came home and I got baptized. But I believed that there was a God, and I believed that I was to follow my husband, but I wasn't saved in the true sense of the word. So I really struggled with depression a lot during that time. And I started homeschooling my daughter. My 3 boys were in public school. I started homeschooling my daughter because I was having so much problem with the boys. I thought, I want to do it different. I don't want them, to have that break in our relationship like I was having with the boys. I mean, the boys were getting into some bad things. I mean, the Mormon kids wouldn't have anything to do with my kids anymore, and it was just a tough time. But anyway, I home taught the oldest one, and the little one was like 3, and Lindsay was so different than Callie. Callie was just always did whatever you wanted, and Lindsay wasn't bad or anything, but she just was into everything. She figured out how to open the door, and we had, God had plucked a Mormon family out of our neighborhood, which was predominantly Mormon or pagan, and put a Christian homeschool mom in. She was exactly 10 years younger than me, but her older children were the same age as my 2 younger ones. And Lindsay snuck out of the house, and it was fall, and she didn't have shoes on, and so she walked over to their house, and pretty soon I hear this tapping at my door, and there's my friend with Lindsay, and she said, and I didn't know her at that time, and she had her all wrapped up in her coat, and she says, "Oh, it's so cold out, and your little Lindsay came over without any shoes on, and she's welcome over at my house anytime, but she probably should have her shoes on." I was so embarrassed, and I explained to her that how she'd snuck away from me. Anyway, I think like about a week and a half later, the same thing happened again. Lindsay snuck out, and there was a tapping at the door, and I opened the door, and there's Shelley, and she had this just loving smile on her face, and I mean, this endeared all of us to her forever. But she said, "Lindsay," I was homeschooling with the girls, and all of a sudden I hear this tapping at the door, and I open it, and there stands Lindsay, totally naked, except she had her shoes on, and she goes, "I got my shoes on." And so anyway, she brought her home again, and we became best friends, and she invited me to go to Bible study fellowship with her, and they were doing Matthew that year, and it was so amazing to me because I always felt like God was, had just set it in motion and would never reveal himself to me again. And as we went through Matthew, you can't even talk at Bible study fellowship unless you've done your lessons at home. Well, I just ate it up, and it was like God was communicating. Everything was just for me. And, I would comment in our studies, and people would say, "Oh, wow, I never thought that or got that." And, I mean, it was so rich for me because, and God just started to open things up, like in Matthew 7, verse 14, where it says, "For the gate is small." Well, let me do it in King James. "Because straight is the gate and narrow is the way which leadeth unto life, and few there be that find it." I realized, man, the Mormon gospel is opposite. With the 3 degrees of glory, Christ came and died for everyone. But then it's what, you don't even have to acknowledge Christ to get a degree of heaven. Like the lowest degree is for people like Hitler and murderers and whoremongers. And Joseph Smith said it was so wonderful there that if you knew how wonderful it was, you'd kill yourself to get there. And then the middle kingdom is for nice people that are deceived by, pastors hired by Satan to keep them deceived. But they're nice people and they belong in the middle kingdom. And then the highest kingdom is for those that work, do all their works. And so no one goes to hell except people like Randy and I who've had the fullness of the gospel and turned against it. So it's totally opposite. Do you see? There's few that go to any kind of a hell in a Mormon gospel, whereas in a Christian gospel, few go to heaven compared to how many go to hell. And I had been so bitter that I'd ever been a Mormon. And as I studied Matthew, God just restored me, and I felt so rich. And one of the chapters that is so special to me was chapter 23, where Christ is talking to the Pharisees, and he says, "Then Jesus spoke to the multitudes and to his disciples, saying, 'The scribes and his Pharisees have seated themselves in the chair of Moses. Therefore all that they tell you, do and observe, but do not do according to their deeds, for they say things and do not do them. And they tie up heavy loads and lay them on men's shoulders, but they themselves are unwilling to move them with so much as a finger. And they do things to be noticed of men.'" And, it just hit me that I had been a Pharisee as a Mormon. I did it all. And I felt so righteous and so good. And I really could not see that I was a sinful man or that I needed Jesus Christ. And as my whole family fell apart and I, was basically destroyed, I had nowhere to go except to be convicted of my sin and know that I did need Jesus Christ. And I realized that not only did we have a false prophet in the Mormon church, but we had those changing doctrines that those poor little missionaries had pointed at the Catholics and said their doctrines are always changing. That's how we know that it's not the true church. And I think, how can these people not see that their doctrines have changed? And, I heard someone say, what are the prophecies of Joseph Smith? And there was maybe 3 that ever came true, and one of them was about Rockwell there. If he didn't cut his hair and cut his beard right, that he would die in bed, and, he did die in bed. So, but that wasn't kingdom shattering or anything. And I realized that that these people were keeping me from heaven. They made me make these horrible oaths and covenants in the temple, and then with little regard for me, they changed them. They just changed them. All the things that were supposed to have been restored because they'd been taken away, they changed them. And if you questioned it or asked, you were ostracized. And to this day, I am so angry that if I go to a stake president or a mission president, Randy and I have visited with mission presidents, if we ask questions that they can't answer, that they don't want to answer, they are so nasty and ugly to us and just throw us off. And I think, how dare you? How dare you? I dedicated 10 years of my life. I chose you, serving the church over being the kind of mother maybe that I should have, spending more time with my children. I wanted to kill myself at one point. And these men can't even give me the time of day. To this day, they won't. And they treat us like, we're some horrible people that are doing some horrible thing. And then it gets to the woes in chapter 23. Woe, one of them is, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, pretenders, hypocrites, for you travel over sea and land to make a single proselyte, and when he becomes a proselyte, you make him doubly as much a child of hell as you are." And I think that was me. I was the convert. I was twice the child of hell. A lot of Mormons that grew up in it didn't hold so tight to the things as Randy and I did. I mean, our kids judged people if they drank Coke and Pepsi, and
We drank carob. Chocolate had caffeine.
Carob, yeah. And I realized that here was Christ among those Pharisees. I mean, he was there in physical form among them, and they could not recognize him. They could not see him with their phylacteries and all the religious things. They thought that they were so righteous. They thought that they were doing things so righteously and so well that they didn't even see Christ. And I think that's the Mormon. They're so in control. Even though their women are on drugs and many of them are depressed, they do things so well. They feel so in control of their salvation that they miss Christ, who stands right among them. And of course, as a Mormon, we were always told that the Bible was only correct as far as it was translated correctly. So it was a frightening thing to trust it. But rather than trust a feeling, it's so amazing to be able to open God's Word, and He communicates to you so personally. And regardless of what you're up against, if you will get in His Word, He modifies Himself to communicate to you through His Word about that problem that you're having. And I mean, what an incredible thing. I mean, the scripture says, "I write these things that you may know." He never tells us. He tells us the heart is deceptively wicked. And, it can lead us astray. I mean, how many young girls are led astray by their heart? Or the heart is deceptively wicked. And but as I went on in Matthew, I began to be so thankful that God had brought me through the road that He did, because I understood things in the scriptures that I could never have understood if I had not, been a Pharisee myself. And I look at the things that happen with our children, and they've had struggles. The 3 boys. The youngest one, not so much, but the oldest 2, of course, one of them has gone on to heaven. Jeremy accepted the Lord, and we believe he was saved, but he always had such an anger and hurt about the things that happened to him. And, of course, a lot of them happened out even in the Christian community. We came upon some serious, sinful people. And that's another thing I want to say, to challenge Mormons to really be faithful Bereans, to be in His Word, because coming out of a cult like Mormonism, it is so easy to fall prey to another cult. It's so easy to look to another man. And we just have to be so careful not to do that. But we've had so many wonderful experiences since we've left the church, and I know Randy mentioned the one, but I just wanted to share it again, because it was just such an amazing thing. Is in 2005, we were invited to go to a home where they were going to have. This woman had gotten into one of these pyramid schemes out here, vitamin pyramid schemes out from Utah and in New York, and she was really selling it big to the Amish and Mennonites and everything. And so the family, who must have been fairly important in the church, they got a hold of the stake mission president mission president in New York, who would have been like over Randy's mission, where he was the Cumorah mission. And it was a lawyer who was Orrin Hatch's law partner, and asked him if he would personally go give the lessons to this family. And so she churched with us at the time, and she asked that we come and our pastor come. And I think 3 of our children got to come to that. Our 2 daughters, and our son was visiting, married son was visiting from Utah. And, we told him who we were and where that we lived out here, and we knew a lot of the same people. And he was kind of curious why we were there. I think even though we told him, he still somehow thought we were Mormon, I think. But then as we got going, he started talking about the witnesses to the Book of Mormon, and how, if as a lawyer, boy, what a case he had. And then he asked Randy what he thought about that, and Randy impugned every single one of the witnesses and, impeached. And so he was pretty upset about that. And then he said that the Bible was couldn't be trusted, and had so many mistakes in it and stuff. And I said, well, could you show us, one? And he says, well, Peter said that the writings of Paul
Or a mess.
were a mess. And I said, well, could you show us where that is? And so he went to my youngest daughter and he said, would you look up 2 Peter 3:15 and 16? And let's see if I can find that. Let's see. 15 and 16. And it was like the most powerful thing I've ever witnessed in my life. Because here was this man, and he's probably read this scripture 100 times. Because he knew right to go to it and everything. But he didn't have the spiritual eyes to see. But God showed him. Lindsay read in, it says, and regard the patience of our Lord to be salvation, just as also our beloved brother Paul, according to the wisdom given him, wrote to you, as also in all his letters, speaking to them of these things, in which are some things hard to understand, which the untaught and unstable distort, as they do also the rest of the scriptures, to their own destruction. That hit him right between the eyes. And man, he picked up Randy's arm and slammed it down on his leg. I didn't just fall off a pumpkin wagon. I'm law partner with Orrin Hatch, and I handle all this money and blah blah blah.
Left $1 million a year practice.
Yeah, and he was. You don't do things like that with these missionaries that are in. He had 2 sets of missionaries with him. One of the missionaries got up and started to cry and said, I shouldn't be here. My grandfather was a martyr for the church. And, it was just, we didn't even have to say anything. God's word convicted him right then and there, and it was the most amazing thing. And, of course, the meeting was over, and they never came back. But it really is amazing to think how deceived the Mormons are. I think about Randy's family, and I love them so much. And you cannot say the word Christian like if I say, before I was a Christian, or, to designate time, they'll just get ugly and say, are you saying that we're not Christians? And see, what I read to you out of this about the Christian name, you could say that Mormons do Christian acts, or in a lot of things that they do, just like they say that about us. But they truly are not Christians in that sense. But I always have to say, that's not what I'm talking about right specifically here, although I would like to talk to you about that later. One time I invited one of them to an Adams Road concert but I hadn't told them that they'd all been former Mormon missionaries. So one of my daughters says, Mom, that just doesn't seem honest that you don't warn them that these guys used to be Mormon missionaries, so they don't feel like you're, because they were going to come to this concert. Well, anyway, I made the mistake of calling Randy's niece back, and I told her, I don't want to let you think that in any way I was, trying to deceive you or anything. This concert that we're having at the park, these guys are, most of them, all but one, were former Mormon missionaries, and their message will reflect that. And I said, and now they're Christians. Are you saying we're not Christians? Are you saying my mother's not a Christian? I mean, Randy's sister is like the most wonderful person you can think of. And she is a really good human being and really does nice things and has raised a good family, 9 children. And so I meant no disrespect. And but it was taken so disrespectfully. And I remember one time when we went to Randy's mom's house, I read that scripture, Matthew 23, to his mom, and shared with her how it had convicted me and that I'd been a Pharisee. And Randy's mom is the nicest person. She is so soft-spoken and just such a nice person. But I read that scripture, and I mean, we were all shocked at her response. She put her hands on her ears and did that thing, started shaking her head and saying, stop it, I can't hear anymore. And all I did was read the scripture. And if any of our family watches this, I don't want them to feel offended in any way. But my prayer is that you will hear, pray that God will open your eyes, that you can see that what I'm saying is true. I think about when we rode our truck through the main street of Grantsville, and Randy's niece was she ran us down with her car and was shaking her head and fingering.
Explain the truck.
The What Mormons Don't Tell truck with the big sign on this side. It's just a website, because we know when we were Mormons, there was no place we could go to if we had questions, really. I mean, we had our membership challenged a couple times for things that we weren't really even doing anything wrong. But, I mean, you're just so, held in a box. So here's this website that someone could privately go to and look and see what, if any of their questions could be answered or whatever. We're not calling them liars, or we're not saying they have 3 heads or anything like that. And, but she called my son, and she was in tears and thought, how could our Uncle Randy drive that through my town? That horrible truck. And I mean, she was so offended. So
It was an accident.
and we hadn't, it was on our way from somewhere else, and it really wasn't our mission was to go in that town. But anyway, Randy went to her privately and said, I mean, no offense. And of course her son had just gone on a mission. She said, are you saying my son's a liar? And of course we don't think the Mormon missionaries are liars. I mean, the Mormon missionaries believe, they're true believers, they're good boys who are fulfilling a mission for their church. They don't know that they're being deceived, or all this history that is so painful to hear. They don't know that they're, like those missionaries that came to my home and promised me that, God would destroy the prophet before he'd allow him to lead him astray. Those guys didn't know that Brigham Young taught Adam was God, that Joseph Smith practiced polygamy before he received the revelation. I mean, that there aren't men on the moon. I mean, we're talking, these people are deceived, and it's so sad, but it has caused such a painful rift in our family. I mean, it is so sad to have to stand alone, and so often it's so hard. Christians have I think we'd be such a force. We'd have so many strong Christian churches if people would stop being such wimps. You know, we go to our Mormon neighbors and we start saying something and they, you know, oh, are you saying we're not Christian or whatever? And we, you know, we limp away. We're afraid to be bold. And, you know, we need to be bold for the Lord. And we need to help them to see that they are deceived and that God's word is infallible and that, you know, archaeological evidence backs it up. There's none for the Book of Mormon. You know, the scriptures have changed over and over. And what is wrong with these people? I remember when we did the film in 2005, we came out here and here were those huge billboards up and down the highway. And what did they say? Praise to the man. And you know who the man was? Joseph Smith. And I can remember so many talks in church. I mean, people would say, oh, that's not church doctrine, you know, blah, blah, blah. But these people would talk about Joseph Smith being at the gates of heaven, and he would be the one to decide whether you got to come in or not. And, you know, I met polygamists who, you know, were such genuine people, and many of them had started out regular Mormons and gotten into all the history and, you know, realized that the new and everlasting covenant is the covenant of polygamy, and they had fallen into that. And just how sad to me the wickedness of these men. And I used to think that the men at the top were deceived too, but you know, they know the truth, and they allow, like this Usdorf, or is that his name? Usdorf? Dietrich Usdorf. He's one of the what do you call it? Apostles.
Well, he's in the First Presidency.
First Presidency, that's what I meant. Anyway, he is acknowledging some of this stuff that the cult, you know, that we as the people that are pointing out the mistakes of Mormonism, he's trying to smooth them over and tell them his own way. All the things that, you know, we've been telling our family all this time, he's, you know, saying it, and some people are leaving because of it, and others are saying, see, we admit it now, so, you know, come on back. It's cool. We're all cool now. But they never can do away with what they've done to the who Christ is, who God is. See, I mean, it's such a beautiful thing that God is outside of creation. He never was a man. He never dwelt on yonder planet. He's outside. He's all-knowing, and he lived for eternity, in eternity past, and in the Mormon gospel, he just was a man. I mean, how scary is that? And he just is a little bit further ahead on the timeline, and he's in creation. And one of the prophets said he can think of a time that there maybe was no God at all. I mean, you know, you can find anything in Mormonism. And it's just one thing you can always count on is that it's always changing. And anyway, I'm grateful for the opportunity to share my testimony with you, and I pray for our family and loved ones and all the Mormons out there. And
yeah, would you pray for them right now?
Yeah.
You pray for us.
Dear Heavenly Father, we're so thankful for your word, that we can count on it, that it's true, and it's a plumb bob, a plumb line for our life. And we're grateful for the comfort that gives, the power that it is in our lives. I'm thankful that through your word you communicated with me. I'm thankful for the family that you've given me, and Lord, I continue to ask for healing among my children and forgiveness for my many sins. And I'm so grateful for a godly husband who answered the call and sought you in his life and brought me along. And I'm grateful for the Christian community and the many works that they do to reach out to Mormons. I think of Rob here, who tirelessly stands there on Temple Square or so many places around the country and has insults hurled at him and takes abuse, but his heart is for the Mormon people. His love shines forth, and I'm thankful for people like that. I'm thankful for the people that stood around Temple Square and handed out pamphlets and converted the fellow that made the first God Makers and Jesus Christ, Joseph Smith, and many other books and things to reach out to Mormon people. And I'm thankful for Sandra Tanner and her work and all the people that have been affected by her. I think about the Higleys and what a great story they have. And I wish I'd heard it sooner, that they were faithful to stay home and study the Word with their children so that they would never be led astray again before they went out and looked for a church. That's a far better way than to go out and look for a church and not be founded in the Word as we did. Lord, I pray for our Mormon friends and family, our neighbors. Feel so bad that we're such an offense to them. And I pray that they will know how much we love them, how much we miss their fellowship, and they're accepting us. And again, we're thankful for you and what you did on the cross for us. And I say these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. Hallelujah.